Okay, strategic metals is a really fascinating way to interpret the world. I know I say this a lot, but this class gives you a lot of fascinating ways to think about our planet. And here's one. How do these weird countries on the map that you and I have never heard of, how do they manage to remain independent sovereign countries? Like, you understand, right, that a government needs some sort of wealth generation to tax in order to remain a nation, right? Like, you have an area of land. If you want to manage that area of land, you have to fund governance, and government of land and the people who live there has to be based on taxation of something. So you hear like a weird country like Kazakhstan or the Democratic Republic of Congo or I don't know, Jamaica. And like, I'm not trying to be a jerk. People live there. I'm sure they're lovely places, but how do, like, what is their economy based on, right? This might be your answer. Um, Best way to explain this is a political metaphor. Maybe you've heard the phrase, politics makes strange bedfellows. The idea that people will create a political allegiance with someone who maybe doesn't represent their priorities or their values. So maybe you've heard, as one example, Black Lives Matter activists supported a candidate who had a reputation previously as being sort of punitive against communities of color. Or maybe you heard that Southern Baptists supported a candidate who was like really scandalous and probably did not represent the family values of Southern Baptists. I'm sure you understand this, right? Like, this is a thing that happens in politics because for political reasons, you sometimes support somebody who you don't really like everything about them, but you know they're going to help you achieve your important goals. So for Black Lives Matter activists, it might be reforming policing in America. For Southern Baptist, it might be overturning Roe versus Wade or whatever. I'm not trying to simplify anybody's politics, but I think you understand, right? You have a weird relationship because there's some reason that helps you. So here's the strategic metals. These are ingredients your economy needs but cannot produce internally. That's why they're called strategic. You have to get them through strategic relationships with others. Like, oh man, we want to make cars in the United States, but we don't have aluminum mines in the United States. So where are we going to go for that? And imagine being the country who has the stuff that America needs. I think this is kind of interesting. For the United States, there's a few ingredients that historically we haven't been able to get on American soil. So we had to build trade relationships with countries that could provide these ingredients. And because the United States likes to produce a broad variety of economic content, we need a bunch of international relationships because we cannot make everything our economy uses. The big one is bauxite, which sounds obscure, but the College Board always uses this term. Bauxite is the ore of aluminum. It's the only ore you'll have to know, I'm sorry, but it's like a rock type that when you grind it up and melt it, the aluminum comes out of the rocks. It's called bauxite. It's the ore of aluminum. And you can imagine airplanes, construction material, electronics, cars, all use aluminum. And in the United States, we don't have any. As a matter of fact, if you look at those three choices, Australia has some, but they're kind of far away. Guinea has some, but they're pretty far away. And Jamaica's not very far, so there you go. Jamaica's government is not funded by reggae music or scandalous weekend vacations or whatever. Jamaica's government is primarily funded by heavy state participation in their aluminum industry. Keeps the country running, and they get to have the friendship of nearby superpowers like Mexico, United States, and Canada. There's a whole bunch of these. In the US, these are the big ones. And you don't need to copy the whole thing, but you should probably know at least the top 5 strategic metals. And I only include those countries as an example of that thing I was saying, like, oh, Australia might be rich because they've got all these things that are needed by major economies. Or like, wow, look at South Africa, they export a lot of stuff. Or like, oh, go figure, Gabon, which I didn't think would have any money to make for anything except safaris. Well, they're a leading global supplier of manganese. And it's kind of neat to think, who are the big shots, right? Like the USA, as it happens, is probably the richest nation on earth in terms of resources, not money in the end. I mean, the raw goods that build money. We've got a lot of good stuff. Russia happens to be a big player, and they're one of the only countries that makes nickel, which is a metal used by every other country on Earth, because everybody needs batteries. And so Russia is like the global hoard of this one really critical element. Imagine how that affects their international relationships. Like, think of all the politics that are tied to this. It's fascinating. I don't know, for me, it's fascinating. Like Kyrgyzstan, like I didn't even think that was a real country. Kyrgyzstan has a whole bunch of mercury. There's like a few countries that globally are in the middle of a lot of transactions. So like Chile and Argentina, they're like the places where they move huge amounts of metals out of South America. The country South Africa is like an epicenter for global trade in metals. Likewise, Russia, these are like the middlemen. Fun fact, Japan doesn't really have any resources. Like I'm sure that's not entirely true, but when I look it up, they are, as far as I can tell, the most dependent country on Earth in terms of strategic metals. They ain't got none. Now, strategic metals, if you listen to the examples I gave you earlier, might not sound like the best long-term investment, right? Like, think about what I told you. Batteries that are probably going to be outdated soon. I told you airplanes, like the aviation industry, where's that really going? Cars, like, I don't know, man. Cars, maybe that's a growing market, but construction equipment, this doesn't sound like the hot and exciting economy of your generation, right? In your generation, the hot and exciting economy, obviously, is electronics. And electronics have all of these weird little ingredients. They're these obscure elements that are almost make-believe. They are the bottom of the list of the ingredients in the Earth's crust. Remember how you did like the top 3 or 4 ingredients in the Earth's crust? Oxygen, whatever, I don't remember anymore. If you get to the bottom of that list, there's the least common stuff. Right? Like 0.00000000003% of the Earth's crust is one of these that's circled on my screen there. They're called the rare earth elements, and they've got a whole bunch of other terms. I'm sorry, rare earth metals, rare earths, like people will often just call them rare earth, plural rare earths, rare earth oxides. There's a bunch of other names, but these are obscure metals used in fancy engineering. Some nerd figures out like, oh, if I sprinkle a little blah blah idiom into my cell phone battery, the battery lasts longer. And that nerd makes $1 trillion and we get fancier phones that last longer. And all of a sudden, the whole world is looking for blah blah idiom. Now comes the most interesting geopolitical detail that no one's ever told you about. The United States used to be the world's leading producer of rare earth elements. We had a couple of mines in sunny Barstow that produced probably they were like the mother lodes of rare earth metals. But those mines were closed a long time ago because who the heck needs these rare earth elements during like the 1960s and 70s? We didn't think they were very valuable. We did know that all these weird oxides made really funky runoff. And so the pollution from these mines was heinous. So in the 1960s and 70s, when the United States started to protect their water quality and their ecosystems, we closed those mines. And at around the same time, 1960s and 70s, there was one global economy that was starting to really explode in volume. Do you know which global economy really took off in the 1960s and 70s? Imagine being China and having almost all the world's supply of those fancy rare ingredients that let you develop all the cool new cutting edge electronics. Better satellites, better batteries, better antennas, better transistors, better conductors. Imagine being a country with more geniuses than the United States has students overall, right? Like we don't have as many students as China has geniuses on the IQ spectrum, or however you want to compare. China has a whole bunch of development happening. They are planning really carefully how to keep their economy growing, because their economy exploded and then started to plateau, and now their economy is just kind of putting along like so many other global economies. But what are the secret tools that China has in their future planning toolkit? Well, here's one. They have the nicest stash of rare earth oxides, rare earth elements. I think that's really interesting. All the other countries are going to have to be nice to China. They're going to have to get in line. China is not legally forced to share. So, kind of wonder how that's going to turn out. I think that's neat. I'm going to stop this video.